When God created man, man had desire. Adam and Eve, the originators of mankind, were expelled from the Garden of Eden after eating the forbidden fruit. Since then, the mist of desire has followed man forever. The movie we're going to tell you today is Firelight, starring the sexy Sophie Marceau. She's the perfect choice to interpret a movie about desire. Into a dark room walks a dignified woman with a dark expression. She has a delicate face and looks like she came out of an oil painting, but she's obviously in some kind of predicament. Her cardamom-colored lips were tightly pressed, and when she spoke, her tone was cold and unruffled. Yes, fate had not been kind to this proud and dignified cold beauty. She was forced to sell herself as a surrogate to pay off the debts of her dependent father, a path that was not very honorable. The woman's name is Elisabeth, and her mission is to bear the child of her employer, Charles, within 3 days. After giving birth, Elisabeth must leave immediately. She and Charles must make a clean break and forget the whole thing ever happened. After dinner, Charles came to Elisabeth's room. The two of them kissed each other through a thin corset. The two of them completed their task in a clumsy manner. The next night, things took a slight turn for the worse. Elisabeth released the barriers of her body and mind and tried to interact with this man. She had developed a slight, if any, crush on Charles. She didn't want to know anything about him. After all, it's just a simple transaction. There will never be an ending between them. On the last night, the two of them were in love, unleashing their secret and forbidden love. After 3 nights, the weak bond between the two was cut short by the blade of the world. Elisabeth stood at the edge of the boat, the cold wind blowing in her face. The sea mist surrounded her, and there was a hint of melancholy and sadness in her eyes. They never saw each other again. Charles continued to be a nobleman, and Elisabeth earned her living as a governess to the nobility, nursing her child under the care of her servants. However, after giving birth, before she had a chance to look at her daughter, she was taken away. At this point, the servant's gray eyes were full of pity. She reassured Elisabeth that it was all over. But the sacred feelings of a mother's love is born the moment the child grows inside her. Even when the child is gone, a mother's heart is always tethered to her child. Elisabeth was sad, but she couldn't do anything about it. She knew that the child's departure was part of the deal and had to be accepted. 7 years have passed. In the midst of all this displacement, Elisabeth still hasn't forgotten the daughter she never got to meet. Every year, on her birthday, she would draw a picture in her album to console herself. The world is a big place, and not everyone who meets has the chance to meet again. But fate threw Charles and Elisabeth into the same dye bath. Their lives were stained with the same color. On this day, Elisabeth was hired to teach her young, ignorant children at a nobleman's house. To teach her young and ignorant daughter, Louisa. Louisa, according to the servants, was wild and unreasonable. Her father's indulgence made her disobedient. Several governesses had been expelled before Elisabeth. Then Elisabeth went to the window. Elisabeth looked through the blurred glass and saw Louisa rowing in the distance. On the cold surface of the lake, Louisa, with her pale face and ice blue eyes, slid her oars. Back in the house, although her face is full of pride, but Elisabeth could see at once that it was not rebellion, but a deep-seated loneliness and helplessness. Louisa came into the room, looked at Elisabeth, spat out a slow, mocking word, and left without looking back. She didn't know that this was the mother she'd always wanted. Then Charles came back. He was sitting on the couch, laughing with his guests. But when Elisabeth appeared before him, Charles's smile faded as he looked at her. Shock, panic, confusion. All the right emotions flashed across his face. Then he smiled and entertained his guests as if nothing had happened. When no one was looking, Charles pulled Elisabeth into a secluded area. He asked her why she was here. He yelled in agitation and vowed to get Elisabeth out of the house. He vowed to get Elisabeth out of the house and out of Louisa's sight. It was clear that Elisabeth's presence had shattered Charles's quiet, boring life. Years ago, his wife fell off a horse and became a vegetable. Charles loved his wife and stayed with her day and night. Even with his wife gone, he'd never thought of finding another woman. But his affair with Elisabeth was an exception. As a nobleman, Charles needed an heir, something his paralyzed wife couldn't do for him. So he found Elisabeth. At this point, Elisabeth argued her case. Elisabeth argued that she couldn't stand by as a mother and watch her beloved daughter be left unattended and have a miserable life. After some tugging and pulling, Charles reluctantly agrees to let Elisabeth stay for a month to teach his daughter. During that time, Charles's partner took a liking to the charming Elisabeth. He wants her to marry him. If she didn't have a daughter, this would be the best place for Elisabeth. But she loved her daughter so much that she didn't want to leave, having just found her long-lost daughter. In the end, she refused. Elisabeth spent the next few days teaching Louisa. Her only wish was for her daughter to have a free mind in a male-dominated society, a life of her own, free from all constraints. On the other hand, Louisa, who was a free spirit, was suddenly bound. Charles was distraught and had a big fight with Elisabeth. He warned her not to hurt Louisa. But as a mother, Elisabeth refused to give up the chance to teach her daughter. She said, with all due respect, to let it go would only ruin Louisa's life. Elizabeth's persistence impressed Charles, and he let go. When Louisa got angry and knocked over her plate, Elisabeth went on a hunger strike with her. Paint was thrown at her for swearing. With all the fixes, the days went by. And sure enough, Louisa changed a lot. She began to behave herself and communicate with Elisabeth in a friendly manner. This pleased everyone in the house. At the same time, Charles and Elisabeth were rekindling their relationship. They were so in love that they let their long-held feelings burst forth. One day, Charles's father returned to the manor. Whispers from the servants alerted him to his son's relationship with this strange woman. He called Elisabeth in and asked her a series of pointed questions. At that moment, looking at the calm, unassuming woman in front of him, the old lord smiled. He knew that Elisabeth was the one person his son needed. However, the sensitive Louisa, after discovering his father's relationship with Elisabeth, was lost in thought and headed for the frozen lake. Fortunately, Elisabeth saved him in time. From that moment on, Louisa had a sneaking feeling that her mother might be close by. But Charles had too many responsibilities. He couldn't take his daughter and his love away without a fight. But things took on a new dimension. The Charles family business had been in decline due to mismanagement. Finally, in this cold and windy winter, they went bankrupt. Everyone in the house looked at each other in silence, but no one was worried. They knew that this winter would bring a new life for all of them. Charles knelt before his wife's bed and wept bitterly. He'd always loved her as the love of his life. If Elisabeth hadn't reappeared, he probably would have continued to live his life with such discipline. But then, Charles realized that letting his wife go was the best thing that could happen to her. So he opened the window and froze her to death. At this point, Louisa is saddened by the death of her adoptive mother. She goes to Elisabeth's room and finds a picture book on her desk. When she opened it, she realized her real mother had been with her all along. Louisa finds Elisabeth.
Why did you give me away?
I didn't. I sold you.
How much for?
£500.
Is that a lot?
It's a fortune.
I'm glad it was a lot.
After the funeral, Charles plans to move his family out of the estate and start a new life somewhere else. Two people in love are finally unchained and get what they want. Chekhov said, "Indifference is paralysis of the soul, premature death. People are born with desires, and sometimes they are confronted with legitimate desires. We can't stand on moral high ground and criticize others." If Charles had never married and lived alone with his paralyzed wife, he would have been praised by many. But would Charles be happy? Would his wife want him to be? After all, human beings are human beings. It's never wrong to face your reasonable desires.